welcome. A special shout out to the folks in Portland who were going to host us today. And here we are, not in Portland, except for those who are in Portland, of course. But thank you to the folks at Allen Avenue for their willingness and all the things you did do to prepare us to be together. Thanks to everybody for showing up in a new space in this way. I'm Meg Groot, one of your New England Region staff. I'm co-presenter today with Erica Barron, and you've already met Karen Bellavance Grace, who's running the tech. I can tell you a little bit about who registered. I'm not sure everybody's here. Some people I know couldn't come, but we had a group that registered from Allen Avenue. So anybody from Allen Avenue, wave your hand. We can see who you are. Yay, welcome, welcome, welcome. There's quite a group from Augusta who registered, Augusta, Maine. Folks from Augusta, yay, in the house, excellent. Did the person who registered from Damariscotta, is that person here, if you want to wave? Oh, great. Hi, Janie. There's someone here from Pittsfield, Maine. There we are. Excellent. Portsmouth, New Hampshire in the house. Yay, Angela. Hey. And some folks from Tamworth, New Hampshire. Yay. Nice to see you, Barbara, and maybe others. And then we have Susan Lawrence in the house. Susan, if you want to wave to everybody, Susan is a colleague of ours on the UUA staff. She works for Ministries and Faith Development and is interested in the topic and has joined us. Joe Sullivan is here. He's lurking in the background, making sure that Erica and I are doing a good job. And Kathleen Henry is here. Now, Kathleen is here because she and a few other people are on the Commission on Appraisal, and the UUA's commission is currently working on the topic of covenant. So Kathleen, so glad you're with us. I hope that, you know, what we have to offer is helpful to your work on your team. Thank you for that ministry. To all of you, thank you and your congregations for the ways that you support the work of the UUA, the work of our staff, but also the Association of Congregations, how you help each other out as congregations. Thank you for your prayers, especially at this time, for your congregations and for each other. And thank you all the time for living your UU values in all the ways that you do that every day. So glad you're here, glad we're together. Yeah, we've adapted a workshop that was going to happen in person. So it might be a little bit bumpy. So we ask for your grace as we navigate this platform. And some of you may be learning this for the first time. So welcome to the world of virtual space, virtual togetherness. Hope you had a chance to print out your workbook. If not, there should be a link in your chat window to get that. The second part of this is happening on March 31st, 7 to 9 o'clock. And after that second part, we will send you a document that has slides in it, that has notes, and we will also follow that one up with a survey for this two-part experience. So welcome, welcome, welcome. When you registered, we asked you a few questions, and just want to share some of a sampling of some of those answers that we got. The first question was, why are you registering for this workshop? So one person wrote that they want to understand more about how do we honor our covenants in practice, especially when that's hard, like when we're in the middle of conflict and disagreement. Another person said they want to learn more about how to return to covenantal relationships even when not everyone is willing. So for those who are willing, how do we do that despite other people's unwillingness. And some people, another person said, a promise to be real with one another and to take care in our communication. And then some people have already taken some of our other spiritual leadership workshops and are interested from that experience in going deeper on practices of spiritual leadership. Another question we asked was, what comes to mind when you hear covenant? One person wrote, a promise of mutual respect. Someone else wrote, living into our shared values intentionally. Someone wrote, relationships and sacred promises made of care and respect. And this next one might be my favorite because it's really honest. Not that the other ones aren't, but this one is like, so this person wrote, I bring a lot of prejudice against covenant as a stuffy authoritarian concept. I don't have the UU background to see this word in a positive light. Now, I am very grateful to the person who said this, who registered despite the prejudice. Clearly, there's a willingness to explore what that prejudice is about and see if there's anything worthy behind what seems unworthy at the moment. So I hope that shifts for that person over this webinar time. And another question I really liked is, I wonder how this concept of covenant, how does covenant differ from simply living our 7 principles? And in the end, maybe there's not a difference. And how to live our principles is a covenantal question. Our third question was, what congregational needs do you hope the workshop will address? And some people lifted up a hope for more leadership skills, a hope for increasing trust and faith in each other. And one person wrote, I want to know how to implement covenant so that it really has meaning. Friends, that is what we're here to look at today. What does this central concept of our faith mean for us in real ways? I turn it over to Erica for some brief worship.
It has been quite a week, hasn't it? Scary, interesting, confusing, surprising, even enlivening sometimes, but long, a very long week. A week in which we are relearning just how interconnected we all are. This morning, we are going to use a song that we've used before, but the words feel like they have new weight as the coronavirus spreads across the globe. The words are in your workbook, and they are, when the world is sick, can't no one be well, but I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. Please join us in a spirit of worship as we watch this video together.
Rin, I'm not hearing any words. I'm not hearing the sound.
Yeah, we don't seem to have sound. Can we pause that and try again?
This is what we call learning in public. Let's try this again. Apologies.
When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. When the world is sick, can no one be well? But I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. When I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. But I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong. And I dreamt we was all beautiful and I dreamt we was all beautiful and strong.
The contrasting images of this video and the contrasting lines of the song are the heart of the practice of covenant. The world is sick. None of us can be well in this world, and yet in our hearts we can imagine the well world, and we know it is possible. A world in which we are all beautiful and strong. So much is wrong, and yet so much is possible, all at the same time. Covenant recognizes that we each cause heartache, that each of us experiences wounds, and each of us causes wounds, and yet we all also have the power to heal and to make whole, both wounding, healing, again and again and again. Today we lift up the lifeblood of Unitarian Universalism, the mysterious faith in possibility and well-being as we experience heartache and wounding. Covenant is the foundation of Unitarian Universalism. We are brought together by the promises we make and how we keep them. There is a poem by the Persian mystic and poet Rumi, most of which will sound familiar to many of us, that goes like this. Come, come, whoever you are, wanderer, worshiper, lover of leaving, it doesn't matter. Ours is not a caravan of despair. Come, even if you have broken your vows 1,000 times, come, yet again come, come. In the line that we often leave out when we sing it, we find the essential good news of Unitarian Universalism. Even if you have broken your vows, the promises, the covenant still stand. Covenant promises and provides the strength that invites us back into relationship. Now, because covenant is a practice of spiritual leadership, it is one we may have to practice 1,000 times and 1,000 times more. But with love, through love, we can come back and we can become beautiful and strong together. Amen. Mac, you are muted.
Thanks, Erica. We sent you a link to our paper that the staff team wrote on the practices of spiritual leadership. I hope you've had a chance to read that and possibly even reread it for those who have had access to it for some time. I'm just going to do a quick overview of the practices. But before I do that, I just want to lift up a claim we make in that paper. And our claim is that the purpose of congregations is to equip people to step into and live their spiritual leadership. The purpose of a congregation is to help each of its members exercise their spiritual leadership. And what that means is that our congregations are there to help us navigate between our power that comes to us from many places. Some of it is because society gives us that power, and some of it is because we have power from within. We have that power, but there's also a lot in the world that we are powerless over. How do we navigate what we have power around and where we do not have power? The power inside of us can connect us to spirit, can connect us to our dreams, can connect us to the gifts that we have and our inner wisdom, to the power of a vision of beloved community, of collective liberation and collective well-being. So there are a lot of kinds of leadership, and your New England Regional Staff Team understands that the kind of leadership that is drastically missing in our world is what we are calling spiritual leadership. And so we've kind of put a lot of our eggs in this basket. It's our commitment to Unitarian Universalism and to the people who are Unitarian Universalists that we support you to create congregations in which spiritual leadership can thrive. So in our development of this idea of spiritual leadership in this way, we've named 5 practices. The first one we've named is the practice of centering in gifts. And this is a practice in which a congregation identifies, affirms, and celebrates the unique genius of each person in that congregation and people beyond the congregation, of course. So imagine a congregation that receives the gifts of its people, that spends time in discernment with every person around what their gifts are, discerns with people where their gifts are needed. Ren, can you just click as we go into the practices just to anchor it? Okay, so the next one is doing our inner work. Yesterday I had a kind of a meltdown day. I went to the grocery store. I thought I'd lose my mind around trying to figure out how to keep myself germ-free, and I had no way to know how to do that. And it really became clear to me that there's a lot going on in that inner landscape, and managing all of that reactivity is really hard. We've been conditioned in many ways. Our personalities are certain things. So within us, part of our work in spiritual leadership is to really kind of center ourselves, to get connected to spirit, to notice what is the impact of our interactions, notice what choices we are making, and really kind of being aware and intentional about managing our reactivity and living from a place of our deepest, best self. The practice of binding to tradition is about congregations really working out, what does it mean to be Unitarian? What does it mean to be Universalist? What does it mean to be Unitarian Universalist together? What is the religious legacy that we inherit as part of that tradition? How do we take seriously the gifts that that tradition has brought through its history? And how do we attend to the harm that that tradition has also caused over time? It is our responsibility to know what that tradition is and to lift up the gifts and deal with the ways in which harm has been caused. The practice of covenanting is the one we're going to look at today, so I won't really spend time there right now. The final one that we've named is the practice of faithful risking, and this one is about moving out of our comfort zones and really being conscious and intentional about trying new things to live more deeply and faithfully our mission and purpose. So we have made a commitment to develop workshops around each of these practices. And the first one that we've deepened and created a workshop for is around this one of covenant. And last spring, we offered the workshop in real time to people in Harvard, Massachusetts, where a bunch of congregations teams got together. And out of that, because the experience for many people in that workshop was so resonant and was so enlivening and deepening of their sense of what living covenant could mean, our team became part of a larger learning community with 5 congregational teams around what does living covenant in a congregation really look like. And so part of the workshop that we've developed since has been informed by our experience of being part of that learning community. We're also informed by conversations that are happening around in wider spaces in the UUA and beyond. Evidence of that is the Commission on Appraisal's focus on covenant, of course. But why did we begin with covenant? Like, why would that be the first practice for us to go into in a deeper way? And one reason is because covenant is not something that the wider culture asks us to live. It is, the very notion of covenant is counter-dominant culture. It's much easier not to covenant. It's much easier to live without this practice because there's not much to reinforce it in our wider culture. And yet, covenant is the lifeblood of Unitarian Universalism. Unitarian Universalism is not a creedal tradition. It's not a sacramental tradition. It is a covenantal tradition. And even though that's true, many congregations have just kind of let covenant go fallow, or it gets misapplied. And so as a staff team, we feel some urgency around our congregations remembering what covenant means, to recenter in practices of covenant, and to deepen an understanding of covenant. So that's why we picked this one to go in more deeply on, and let's get into it. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that larger culture because you know, I've made this bold claim that covenant is counter-dominant culture. I'm going to talk about 3 domains in society, and we got this idea from Gil Rendell, who in his book Behavioral Covenants in Congregations, and he got it from John Fletcher Moulton, Lord Moulton, a 19th century British lawyer and judge and parliamentarian, who basically said there are 3 domains in society, and these determine how we behave as human beings. So I'm going to get into each one. The first one he calls the domain of law. Karen, can you bring up that slide? So in the domain of law, our actions are prescribed by what's written by parliamentarians and others. And these laws are there to ensure that we are in conformity with the group. And in order to make sure that that conformity is maintained, people are kept in check with consequences. If you step outside the rules, you will that you will experience consequences. So the focus really is on what are the rules. And these rules and people's behavior can be policed and enforced. That is the domain of law. Now, there's another domain that Lord Moulton calls the domain of free choice. In the domain of free choice, people can enjoy complete freedom about how they act. They only have to conform to themselves. Basically do what they want, and it can all just center on their own preferences. And in this realm, there's no need for oversight, so there's no need for monitoring. Now, these two domains are often in tension. And here's an example of, an easy example for illustrating that. There's a polarity between law and free choice that can be shown in the example of what kids wear to school. So for example, there are people who believe that school uniforms are the best way for children to focus on their education, to not worry so much about self-expression, to really kind of be there for the learning and not be distracted by other things. There are also people who believe that children should be able to express themselves quite freely, and one way they can do that is by the clothes they wear, be it shorts, neon colored hair, body piercings, ripped jeans, whatever. And so there's a tension here between rules and autonomy, between uniformity and individuality. And that tension lives in congregations. I'm sure that all of us can come up with examples of that, but we have a story to illustrate that, and it's in your workbook. I'm going to read it just so that we're all, because sometimes it helps to hear it as well. For some people, that helps rather than just visually reading it. But you can follow along on page 2. Paul and Sally are a married couple and have been longtime members of First Parish of Centerville. Paul is involved with the RE committee, and Sally has been an active member of the Women's Alliance her whole adult life. For 2 years now, Paul and Sally have withheld their pledge as they are opposed to the Black Lives Matter banner hanging on the front of the church building. They believe the banner makes an anti-police statement, which they feel personally since one of their children is a police officer. Because they hold the minister responsible for initiating the campaign to hang the banner, Paul and Sally have been actively trying to turn people against the minister, which mostly takes place during coffee hour. So at certification time, members of the parish council always conduct an annual review of the membership list and make changes according to the rules for the membership set out in the church bylaws. Those bylaws state that the membership list must be reviewed annually, and membership may be declared inactive if a member does not support the congregation financially or fails to demonstrate interest and loyalty within the preceding year. Inactive members are not removed from the membership list. However, they are not eligible to vote at congregational meetings. This year, the parish council is considering making Paul and Sally's membership inactive. So I'm going to invite you now, just on your own, just reflect on that story for a few minutes, make some notes. Where do you see the domain of law in tension with the domain of free choice at play in this story? So I'm going to invite you, as you think about these things and you feel inclined, to put some of your responses in the chat. Just type them into the chat so we can all have a look to see what kinds of things you're noticing about the story. If you feel more inclined to speak your response, that you can unmute yourself and share that way as well. All right, so the domain of law, says Janine, is about the rule about who gets to who's qualifies as a voting member. Exactly. And where do we see some free choice happening in the story? At coffee hour. Yes, we do. We see it happening at coffee hour. Thanks, Angela. Free will is also showing up in prioritizing individual personal interest over the choice of the community. Yes, and withholding the pledge. This is, nobody's going to make me pay my pledge. So there's some autonomy there, and yet there may be consequences. The domain of free choice invites Paul and Sally to not pay membership and to diss the minister, and allows others in the congregation to not listen to Paul and Sally. Loyalty is subjective, probably free will, but muddy when trying to enforce. Yes. Paul and Sally break the laws and covenant with church by not paying the pledge. And here's a question. I wonder who and how the decision to display the banner for the Black Lives Matter, how did that come to be, right? Where does law and free will fit in that? Yeah, so there's a story behind the story as well, of course, always. Also determining leadership structures and back channel organization against the minister and or the congregational leadership. John says, I added a booster which temporarily oh, sorry, John, you're back, good. Okay, all right, thanks friends, thanks for engaging in that. So what I'm going to invite us to look at now is a third domain. And this is the domain in which we see congregational life living out. Lord Moulton called it the domain of manners. And it's in the space between law and free choice. So it's in the space between the poles. So what we see here is, in a sense, more of a spectrum. We are calling this domain the domain of covenant. And here's a phrase that I don't think is in your workbook, but you might want to write down because it's a beautiful phrase from Lord Moulton. In this domain, people practice what he calls, quote, obedience to the unenforceable, unquote. In other words, this is the area in our lives where we act not because we are forced to do so, as in the domain of law, but we choose to act even though we have the freedom not to. And we do it because we understand it as the right thing to do. So we discipline ourselves to do it. And we do it even though there's no one there to make us do it but ourselves. This is the place where congregations live, in this middle terrain of relationship and mutuality. So in this domain, the domain of covenant, our actions demonstrate moral behavior. This is about choosing to do the right thing in conformity with our shared values. And the discipline around it is to do what is right. So it all centers on our understanding of moral behavior. And nobody's making you do it, nobody's monitoring you in it, but the community is there to help you and hold it as you reinforce it together. Some people join Unitarian Universalism because there is an emphasis on autonomy. There's an emphasis on your personal preferences mattering. You get to choose things. You get to do your own thing. There's a lot of free will in Unitarian Universalism. At the same time, we also have, as the story illustrates, in our congregations, we have policies because we need some kind of structure. We need to ensure that there's safety. And that place we can call the domain of law in congregations. But most of life in a congregation at its best is in this third space, in what we are calling the domain of covenant, where you are obedient to the shared values and no one can make you do it but yourself. So we're going to invite you to spend a little time in breakout groups, and Karen is going to assign those groups to you. In your booklet on page 3, there are a couple of questions that we'd invite you in your breakout group to talk about. What are the shared values in your congregation that you choose to be faithful to? And if those values were what the focus is in the Paul and Sally story, what difference might that make to that story? I'm not entirely sure how much time you have. We're a little behind time, aren't we? But I think you'll be in there at least 10 minutes. You will have, we'll give you a warning a couple of minutes before it's time to close out the breakout group. You'll see something flash across your screen that tells you that it's coming up time. But give everybody a chance to spend some time addressing the questions. I think you'll be in groups of about 3. Ren, is everyone back? Oh no, not quite.
I think we are now.
Great. All right, friends, I hope that was a good experience. We are going to move into the next portion in which Erica will be leading. But before we do that, I just want to check in to see if there's anyone has a burning question based on what we've already talked about and what happened in your small groups. Any burning questions? All right, Erica, over to you.
Okay, so as you heard from Mech, John Moulton called that middle domain between law and free choice the domain of manners. And he meant more than the rules of politeness, but his use of the term manners points us to an important way that our covenants can be limiting, which is, whose idea of good manners are we asking people to be obedient to? Now, when we're talking about covenants, ideally, that is our shared values and mission as a congregation, and those are often included in what we call behavioral covenants. But a lot of other stuff can tend to creep into our covenants too, things that are more grounded in a particular culture than in our values. So we want to take a moment now to think about the ways that behavioral covenants can be limiting and what a more liberating practice of covenant might look like. So we are relying in this section on some descriptions of dominant white culture in the United States that come from a book called Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social change groups by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okun. If you're intrigued by this as we go through it, you can find in your workbook the information that would help you find that book. And I just wanted to mention that we are talking today about specific features of dominant culture that they describe that also feel resonant to us about the way that Unitarian Universalism often manifests. And there's a chart in your workbook on the differences between limiting and liberating covenant, and we're going to take a little walk through that right now. So starting with, Jones and Okun identify one of the features of dominant culture is an expectation of comfort. So we can sometimes practice covenant in a way that attempts to create comfort by controlling behavior. In fact, we often call our covenants behavioral covenants. And there's something important and valuable here, which is the recognition of a right to a basically safe space, meaning a space that is free of things like harassment, bullying, dominating behavior, physical violence, abuse of various kinds. But we can sometimes have a tendency to take this focus on comfort too far and attempt to control the behavior of especially other people in a way that will create the most comfort for the majority in the congregation. And if we go too far in this direction, it can stifle real interaction and creativity. It can limit who feels welcome and included in that covenant. And it can lead all of us to believe that the way to be faithful to our covenant is to practice a sort of basic politeness rather than deeper connection. And that can lead us to hiding part of ourselves that don't conform to the established norms as we understand them. So a more liberating approach to covenant means moving toward liberating beloved community. Beloved community is a big concept and it means many different things, but one of the things it means is that everyone can bring their whole selves. So liberating covenants, to be faithful to them, requires our full presence, meaning our authenticity and our vulnerability. And rather than trying to create comfort, these covenants help us to create braver space together, meaning space where we are all supported to take risks, supported to move out of our comfort zones in service of our own spiritual growth and true liberation for all people. Which brings us to the way that our covenants function during conflict. So this is another place where we can sometimes write covenants that are more limiting than we intend. So Jones and Okun say that another feature of dominant culture is a fear of open conflict. And this leads us sometimes to write covenants that are designed to prevent all conflict. And the little bit of conflict that we can't possibly prevent, we then want to strictly control the way we behave during conflict. Now the problem with this is, or one problem with this, is that when we write these covenants, we often are not aware that different cultures differ quite dramatically, actually, in their understanding of what appropriate conflict behavior looks like. So there's a number of ways that cultures differ in their approach to conflict, but a really important one is the level of emotional expression that is considered appropriate during a conflict. Dominant culture in the United States and dominant culture in most Unitarian Universalist groups prefers a restrained conflict style, which means quiet, even voices and very still bodies. But there are other cultures that believe that the appropriate way to behave during conflict is to be much more expressive, meaning louder voices, more dynamic voices, big body movements, everything all louder. So there are a number of different communities that prefer that more expressive conflict style, including some African American communities, some Jewish communities, and some working class communities. So when we write covenants in our congregations about how to behave during conflict, especially if we get really specific about what behaviors are okay and what behaviors are not okay, we can end up inadvertently defining the dominant culture within the congregation as covenantal in its approach to conflict and defining other cultural conflict styles as uncovenantal. Which means that the covenant is essentially writing some people in and writing other people out in terms of how we are in conflict together. So what would a more liberating approach to conflict look like when it comes to our covenants? The first thing is to recognize that conflict is inevitable in real community. In fact, some people believe it is necessary for real community. A lot of different people have talked about this, but one of them is M. Scott Peck, who writes about the difference between what he calls pseudo-community and actual community. And he says that pseudo-community is where everyone is being polite and getting along, and in the process of trying to be polite and getting along, you kind of hide your real self. Whereas genuine community is where everyone can really be fully themselves and fully present. And he says that the only way to get from pseudo-community to actual community is through conflict. And also, once we arrive at genuine community, there's still conflict, because when actual people show up with their whole selves, eventually there's going to be some kind of conflicting something that we're going to have to work through together. So he describes, or he defines, real community as people who have learned to fight gracefully. So if we take that understanding into our covenants, liberating covenants understand that conflict is going to happen. And so what we're trying to do is not prevent conflict, but create a container for conflict to happen well. What that means is creatively, lovingly, and with everyone bringing our whole selves, including our individual conflict style, cultural conflict style, and personal conflict style, as well as respecting others, including their cultural conflict styles and personal conflict styles, as long as we don't drift into the realm of abuse. So in this understanding of covenant, the fact of conflict is not evidence of a broken covenant. There is going to be conflict. That's just inevitable. So what the covenant is there for is to hold us through the conflict into creative solutions together. So another feature of dominant culture that Jones and Okun describe, they call, quote, the worship of words, unquote, which I think is such an accurate description of a lot of Unitarian Universalism. And like some of the other features that we're talking about, there is some real benefit here. In this case, some beautiful covenantal language. I mean, UU congregations, man, we can write some incredibly beautiful covenants with words of poetry and power that move us and inspire us to live our best selves. And all of that is awesome, and we don't want to take it away. But this is another example of a thing where it's good to a point, and then we can take it too far. And what happens when we take it too far in the realm of covenant is that we come to believe that the covenant can be entirely captured in the words on the page. So, and that leads us to focus on the letter of the covenant, not on the spirit of the covenant. And the best example I've had of this, so we've been talking about covenant as a staff team a lot with a lot of different people. And I was in one conversation with a leader in a congregation who described a conversation in the congregation. So I think they were either writing a new covenant or sort of re-examining their covenantal language. And someone came to this leader and said, you know, every line in our covenant, if you interpret it in a right way, could have a loophole in it. And this just is such a good example of what it looks like to believe in the letter rather than the spirit. Because loopholes isn't a thing when we're talking about the spirit of something, right? So a more liberating approach here would ask us to be faithful. So you heard Max say that Lord Moulton said that the realm of this realm that we're talking about, the middle realm, is about obedience to the unenforceable. So I'm going to add that a more liberating approach to covenant is also obedience to the indescribable. That there is a shared commitment to something beyond or larger than ourselves that we can't entirely capture in language. So we need to focus on the spirit more than the words. The words are still important, they're still useful, but they're useful in the way that a map is useful. They are pointing us towards something. They are not the thing. Just as a map is pointing out the landscape, but is not in fact the landscape. So another two features that Jones and Okun talk about in dominant culture that are very closely related to each other are perfectionism and either or binary thinking. And this shows up in our approach to covenant in the idea that we often encounter that we are either in covenant or out of covenant. If we are in covenant, we are perfectly keeping all of our promises and there is no conflict. And if we are out of covenant, we have broken all of our promises, or we are in conflict, which is evidence that we have broken our promises. And there's an understanding that there's a sort of binary division between these two states. We are in or we are out. And this kind of has a hardness to it that I think is unhelpful, or we think is unhelpful. So it leads us to be hard with ourselves. It leads us to be hard with each other in this, and it can lead to sort of shaming of ourselves and others, as in, you've broken it, you're bad, and we have to fix it. And that can get us down a path that we don't want to go. So a more liberating approach recognizes that we both keep and break our promises at the same time, kind of all the time. We're always keeping some of them and breaking others. We're breaking them to a certain extent. We're not keeping them perfectly. We're always learning to do better. And so one day we understand that this thing we thought was keeping our promises is in fact kind of stomping all over them, but we just didn't realize it. So the liberating approach accepts that people are imperfect, that falling short and failure are also inevitable, just like conflict. And so asks us to approach our covenants in the spirit of forgiveness of ourselves and each other. This understanding seeks a continuous restoration and renewal of our covenants. UU Minister Victoria Safford describes this and says that a covenant may be reinforced by forgiveness and grace when we stumble or forget or mess up. And in this understanding, a breach of covenant does not mean that we are entirely out of covenant. We're always in the covenant. The covenant is holding us on our way back through reconciliation. So we are gonna stop here for a bit. There's one last item on the chart in your workbook, and we're gonna come back to that in a little bit. But first of all, let me check the chat because people are talking. Yes, though you've broken your vows 1,000 times, exactly. So we are going to send you back into some breakout groups. And I think that these questions are in your workbook. The question is, when have you experienced a limiting practice of covenant? And when have you experienced a liberating practice of covenant? What we're going to ask you to do is let each person in your group answer these two questions together at the same, like, it's not one round of one and one round of the other, but each person gets to talk about both questions for up to 2 minutes. And then whatever time you have left, you can talk together about some themes that you see that are common among you. You have a total of 10 minutes in your group. And I think that's all I need to tell you before.
Now, one more thing, because
Yes.
it's become apparent that folks who are on their telephone, to unmute yourself,
Oh, yes.
you need to dial *6. *6 will make it possible for you to participate with your group.
Thank you. So *6, and I think you can go now. See you in a minute. Okay, welcome back. As we are regathering, we're just gonna pause here for a minute, and if you have any questions right now or things you really want to say, we have just a few minutes, but things you really want to say about what you discussed in your groups, you can either put them in the chat or you can unmute yourself and talk if that's a better way for you to communicate with us.
Well, this is Keith. I've got something that I'll throw out to the group, and that is the word covenant itself. There's some synonyms that I might relate to. I mean, giving me a definition that's one sentence long is something that can take a while for me to internalize, to digest. I mean, is this similar to bonding within a group, or shared values? Could you give me some more example of covenant and more explanation of definition, please?
Sure. So Susan is offering covenant is a bounded freedom. It has both liberative and limiting potential, and there will be tension between the two, which is great. At the very most basic level, a covenant is a set of mutual promises. So examples, we're going to talk a little bit about the origin of covenant as a concept in a little bit, which is, it comes to us from the Jewish tradition, where it's promises made between God and the people. The other place, you're muted now if you want to. I didn't hear what you just said, Kevin. Or Keith, sorry.
Yes, I can relate to that. That's very good. That's helpful.
Yeah. The other thing that is helpful to a point, it's an imperfect analogy to our congregations, but helpful to a point, is the other place that covenants show up in our life is in marriage. So the promises that people make when they get married are also a covenant. It's a different kind of covenant, and it's important to remember that it's a different kind of covenant, but it's that sense of we are promising some things to each other so that we can be in relationship.
So I was thinking of like, I was in the military for several years, and I swore allegiance to the flag and the nation, the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed that almost all other armies in the world, even British, they swear allegiance to the Queen.
Right.
So their covenant is to the Queen, is
Right.
to a person rather than to society or a concept or an idea. That's an extreme covenant, to swear allegiance. What would be an example of a weak covenant?
Okay, well, let me just say something about the military example first. So in order for it to be a covenant, the country also has to make promises to you. And we could spend all day debating whether our country adequately keeps its promises to the people who have joined the military, but we won't go down that road today. So covenants are as strong or as weak as the faithfulness of the people in them. So some marriage covenants, for example, are super strong because the people in the marriage are really committed to it. Some of them fall apart because we weren't as committed. So there are certainly less formal covenants. I'd say it's kind of the more people are in it, the harder it is to, it gets kind of diffuse at some point. But anyway, I'm sort of speculating now. And Twinkle in the chat says, checking in with covenant frequently so that when conflict shows up, we are practiced and equipped to hold difficult conversations. Yeah.
Could I just add on to that? This is Susan in Augusta, and could I just add on to what Twinkle shared about the importance of the intentionality and deliberateness of creating covenant? I think there's some underlying assumption that our UU faith has the covenant of our principles as kind of an underlying covenant, that we all assume that we're coming to this church with those principles. But the difference between, in the RE program, we would always spend every first Sunday talking about covenant. That was every time. And it seemed like people would say, okay, we always talk about covenant. Okay, we're going to listen to every, there was annoyance about doing that. And yet the deliberate, intentional act of doing covenant and writing it up, I think we forget sometimes in our other groups at church or committees or adults. And if that isn't there to go back to, like, what Twinkle was saying, if you have that covenant and it's sitting on the wall and you come back to it, don't forget about it, but come back to it. But if you don't be really deliberate about that, you make these assumptions that people are all operating under the same covenant, and maybe you realize, oh, whoops, maybe we didn't do that. We've made assumptions are dangerous, I guess.
Yeah, and both of you are lifting up that, like, talking about it and checking in about it is really important. Twinkle also said in the chat that we sometimes use covenants as a weapon, which, yeah, that's kind of what I'm talking about in the limiting covenants, is ways that we are using them to control each other rather than recognizing that they're mutual promises. So
I had one other quick thing. This is Jane. Sometimes it strikes me, and you really made me think about this, that sometimes we think of covenant not so much as promises but as that we agree to do something, and agreeing to do something for each other is not the same thing as being in agreement, as in that we all agree to the exact same things. And I think because we think that somehow agreement means we have to speak with one voice, that anyone who doesn't fall into that what we automatically assume is one voice, is sort of seen as outside the covenant. So I think we mix up covenant and agreement sometimes.
Yeah, good point. Thank you. Okay, so we are going to take a little break right now because we've all been looking at a screen for a long time. So take 5-minute stretch break and come on back, and we will continue. And thank you all for your engagement. Okay, we are regathering. So we're gonna give, looks like some folks are still out, so we're just gonna give it another little bit here. All right, I think we have most people, so I'm gonna move on to that last item on that chart about limiting versus liberating covenants. So this is about the question of how we move our covenants from limiting to liberating, or how do we transcend our own limits individually and collectively? Well, that is hard work, the work of a lifetime, but one way to begin is to widen the frame. So we often think of covenants in our congregations as purely interpersonal, but we can move in the direction of more liberating covenants if we understand ourselves to be in covenant with more than just our fellow congregants, if we create multi-dimensional covenants. Give me just a second. Excuse me. Okay. So we're going to look at some slides together about multi-dimensional covenants. So 20th century theologian James Luther Adams and several others have said that humans have at least 2 different needs when it comes to religious community. One of them is intimacy, which is the realm of interpersonal covenants, or relationships to other people in the congregation. So we might think of this as the horizontal dimension of covenant. But James Luther Adams says we also need something else, which is ultimacy, or a sense of meaning and purpose, connection to something larger than ourselves and even than our congregations. Adams calls this the covenant of being, or covenants responsive to, quote, the creative, sustaining, and transforming powers that are ultimately not of our own making. So we can think of this as the vertical dimension of covenant, connecting us to something higher or something deeper, depending on your theological worldview. So, as I said it a minute ago that we're going to talk about the origins of covenant. Here it comes. We get this idea from the Jewish tradition. This is where the practice of covenant begins in religious language. And in the Jewish tradition, of course, the ultimacy dimension means God. God initiated the covenant, and God is always a partner to the covenant. In fact, God is always the most important partner in the covenant. But Unitarian Universalists do not have a unified understanding of God. And we don't want our understanding of covenant to impose a particular view of the divine and our relationship to it. So we often just leave this part out. But this can make our covenants too small and too limiting in many ways, some of which we have just discussed. So what is a theologically diverse community to do? Well, there are lots of Unitarian Universalists, and so there are many different answers to this question, but we want to talk about 2 of them today. One way to think about the ultimacy dimension in UU contexts is to think about our shared commitment, our expansive vision of higher purpose or mission as the ultimacy dimension. Now that can work as long as it's 2 things. One is shared and the other is expansive. So in order for this to have that sense of bringing us out of ourselves, We have to have a mission that's bigger than just our congregation, something like creating beloved community in the world, to get us out of the interpersonal. The other way of thinking about ultimacy that we want to talk about today comes from our 7th principle, which is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Which is a pretty expansive vision and image that we have collectively. And one of the things that I love about this, our 7th principle, is that it can be seen and appreciated from many different theological places. So for those among us of a rational or scientific bent, it is literally factually true that human life exists within a system of interlocking natural processes, and that our physical survival depends on the health of those processes. But for those of us of a more mystical bent, the interdependent web of all existence is one way of imagining and talking about a larger reality that we might experience as God. So the same phrase can have deep meaning, ultimate meaning, for many different Unitarian Universalists with different theologies. So what might it mean to actually live that in a deep way together? Well, to answer this question, we want to lift up the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer. She's not herself a Unitarian Universalist. What she is a botany professor and also a member of the Potawatomi Nation. So she brings together the scientific understanding of the natural world and the Indigenous American tradition understanding of the natural world. And she actually sometimes talks about this using the word covenant, but often not using that word, but in the realm of our mutual promises and obligations to each other. She especially focuses on our relationship to plants because that's her focus, her particular love. And she says that the natural world gives us innumerable gifts, and our obligation in return is gratitude and reciprocity. So she illuminates a deep understanding of what our covenant to respect the interdependent web of all existence might really mean in thought and practice if we took it as deeply seriously as we could. Now, I highly recommend her whole book, which is called Braiding Sweetgrass, and you have information in your workbook that can help you find it. But we want to give you just a taste of her work today with a video. So I'm going to let Karen help us watch that. And we're missing sound again.
My apologies. Once again, I forgot to unmute myself while presenting the video. Here we go. Take 2.5.
If I could choose just a single element of the traditional teachings that we're called to pick up, it would be the teachings of the honorable harvest, which were taught us by the plants, who give us everything that we need. It's a covenant of reciprocity between humans and the living world, a very sophisticated ethical protocol. One of the first steps of the honorable harvest is to understand that the lives that we are taking are the lives of generous beings, of sovereign beings. And in order to accept their gift, we owe them at least our attention. To care for them, we must know what they need. And at the very minimum, we should know their names. And yet, the average American can name over 100 corporate logos and 10 plants. Is it a surprise that we have accepted a political system that grants personhood to corporations and no status at all for wild rice and redwoods? The protocols for the honorable harvest are not really written down, but if they were, it would look something like this. When you get to the woods, you don't just start grabbing everything in sight. We're taught never to take the first plant that you see, and that means you'll never take the last. This is a prescription with inherent conservation value. And then if we encounter another plant, we ask permission. I've always been taught to address that plant, to introduce myself, and tell it what it is that I have come for. If you're going to take a life, you have to be personally accountable for it. I know there are places where if you talk to a plant, they think you are crazy, but in our way, it's just good manners. If you're going to ask, you have to listen for the answer. You can listen in different ways, pragmatically, intuitively. Look around, see whether those plants have enough to share. And if the answer is no, you go home. For we remember that they don't belong to us. And taking without permission is also known as stealing. And the Honorable Harvest counsels that we also take in such a way that does the least harm and in a way that benefits the growth of the plant. Use everything that you take. It's disrespectful of the life that's given to waste it. The next tenet of the Honorable Harvest is to share it with others, human and non. The earth has shared generously with us, so we have to model that behavior in return. And a culture of sharing we know is a culture of resilience. Plant gatherers often leave a spiritual gift behind, but it can also be a material gift. Weeding, caretaking, spreading seeds, helping those plants to flourish. We give songs, we give ceremony, we give our respect, we give fertilizer. Every breath that you take is a breath that was made for you by plants. And the water that you drink, whether you're in an urban setting, whether you're on a remote mountaintop, we still are recipients of those gifts. And if we take the time to be grateful, that brings us into that state of humility, of understanding that we are not at the top of a biological hierarchy, that in fact we are the younger brothers of creation.
So that's just a taste of what that might look like if we lived it more deeply. And from the intersection of intimacy and ultimacy comes a third dimension, which is the dimension of time. So our covenants in our congregations connect us both backward and forward in time. Our congregations continue promises that were made by those who came before us, and that includes both the earlier members and founders of our particular congregations, whether that was weeks ago or years ago or centuries ago, and also our ancestors from the larger Unitarian Universalist tradition in which our local congregations stand. Our covenant with those who came before us calls us to bring forward the best of what they had to offer into the future. We also have a covenant with those who come after us. We create and keep our covenants in our congregations partly so that we have something to hand on to the next generations. That might be our vision of beloved community and our best wisdom for how to build it, knowing that it's always incomplete and hoping that the future will take that and bring it even further. We are surrounded by a society that often thinks in very short-term ways, forgetting that we come from ancestors and that we have descendants we want to be accountable to. How often do we bring our ancestors and our descendants to mind when we make decisions in our congregations? And when we do, are we true to the spirit of that commitment? I invite you to think about those questions, and we're going to have one more time in our breakout groups. We're going to have 10 minutes. I'm sorry, someone's in the chat. Let me just check. Yeah, so Molly's asking if we always plan to use the Honorable Harvest. We decided to use the Honorable Harvest a couple months ago, but yeah, it keeps being apt. It's her work is so excellent. I really recommend it. Okay, so we're gonna go into one more breakout group, and you have 10 minutes to imagine how you might bring the dimensions of ultimacy and time into your congregation's practice of covenant. That question is in your workbook, and I'm gonna let Karen, so you have 10 minutes, and I'm gonna let Karen send you into your groups. So when you're leading a Zoom meeting and everyone's in breakout groups and then you all come back, like suddenly you all pop onto the screen, it's really fun. So I recommend trying it sometime. Welcome back. We have come to the end of what we're going to present today, so we want to take about 5 minutes for any questions or comments. Again, you can either unmute yourself and talk, or you can put them in the chat, and then we'll have a little closing and we'll go our way. So any questions or thoughts at this point?
Yeah, Erica, I'd like to share something. I noticed that a number of you are here in multiples from your congregation. Some of us are here as the only people from our congregations. And I found this a really rich conversation today. And really, really, you folks did a great job putting together such an inspiring program for us, including the breakout sessions, which were totally wonderful, even though they were so short. But so, prefacing my question, is there something that you can do to encourage our congregations to join in these conversations, more than one person? I mean, I don't know why my church doesn't do more of this, and I wish that there was something that you could do to inspire greater attendance by congregations, not just individuals. So that would be my hope for future conversations like this, that we get more involved. It's just hard for one person to make a difference if we can come as 2 or 3. And I'm not sure, I think I'm going to ask you to make that your job, Erica, and
Well,
Karen, and Mac, you know, help.
So let me just we do price our workshops so that it's cheaper to come as a group, as a way of encouraging that. And we say that we encourage you all to come as a group. And I also think that actually our best ambassadors are you. So we can say, you know, there's things that we can say over and over again and people are like, oh yeah, the staff. So the more that you all go out there and tell your friends, oh my goodness, come next time, it was awesome. People will probably take that more seriously. So we'll keep saying it and you keep saying it and hopefully people will listen.
And can I offer that we also, if you're sharing the recording, I'm assuming the recording is much less than 2 hours because you're not recording all the breakout Zoom times. I think one action that I can take is sharing this with my fellow committee members and saying, you know, this is worthwhile, both as long as it's okay with you to share the recording and the little workshop. I think it's really relevant to conflict that we're having now. And if we take it upon ourselves to do the sharing out and maybe even schedule a meeting to talk about it, or something that makes it more likely that it would happen.
Yeah, that's about the only, one of the few benefits of having to meet this way instead of in person is it's on recording. So, yes.
I wanted to say that when the Bernie Sanders people heard I was going to the Democratic caucus, they said, oh, great, bring 3 people. And I've been thinking that's something I should do with everything at our church. We had a terrific presentation on what Portland is doing with solar energy. And it was great. And there were about 18 of us. And I thought we all should have brought 3 friends. So it isn't even just the district stuff. It's our own church does a lot of really valuable things that aren't well attended. And I think I just need to discipline myself to try to bring somebody with me every time I do something.
Yeah, thank you. So Twinkle says in the chat that when we, I'm not gonna be able to capture all of this, but it's important that we honor our covenant, especially when others are not honoring it. Yeah, so we keep our promises, even if we're in relationship with someone who's not, and that can help us all come back together. Other questions or things you want to talk about very briefly before I turn it back over to Mick? Okay, well, thank you all.
Hi, this is Janine
Oh, yes,
from Augusta UU, and just wanted to say how helpful it is to kind of focus. I really appreciate the work that went into this. It's a very thoughtful presentation and reassuring in a way for me as I deal with conflict in the church and in life. And so 1, thank you for that. And 2, I'd say just personally, I like the ideas for how to share it in other ways too that people are putting in the chat, but how helpful it is to realize that that conflict is often at the heart of the hardest parts of this, and to know that you know, I'm not the only person, we're not the only church, and it's just reassuring to know we can get through these things and some frameworks for how to address it. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. I'm glad that was helpful. Okay, I'm going to turn things over to Mick.
Erica. I got a private message from Susan Lawrence in the chat asking about would we be mentioning the Conversations for Liberation, and that wasn't planned, but Susan, would you be can you say something about it for the group?
Sure, just briefly in response to what Angela raised, the UUA in general, not just your wonderful regional staff, but there are some national initiatives going on that allow you to have conversations in a congregational group, and it's sort of part of the practice of covenant. It's not specifically about covenant, but something that came out of last year's General Assembly and some conflicts that came up there generated this Conversations for Liberation thing. And I'll put the link in the chat before we leave once I stop talking, but it engages a congregational group to come together and deal with, one of the questions is something like, well, this is a bit dramatic, but what would I die for in Unitarian Universals? It's that level of conversation that is gets you to focus on why we're in this and why we're in this together and what it means to us. So if people are interested in creating other formats for talking in your congregation, it's something that's local. It doesn't need to be on a Zoom call. Well, I guess it does these days. Anyway, I'll put the link in and you can see if it's something that would be appealing to you to engage some more folks with.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks, Mick.
Yeah, you're welcome. So friends, between now and March 31st, when I'm hoping that all of you can come back for the 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock part 2 of this, we invite you to do some reflection, and we've created some questions. They're on the last page of your workbook. Reflecting is I'm discovering that it's a hard time to be reflective because there's so much happening all around us to sort of stay tuned into and be aware of and everything. But I do think we need to take time for stillness and quiet, and among the things that that you are invited to reflect on is how the ways that we've been framing this is different from the understanding that you came into the webinar with about covenant. What has this helped you understand in new ways or in deeper ways? Then, given the historic moment we are in, how is the practice of covenant showing up in your congregation's response to the coronavirus pandemic? How are people remaining connected with community? How do you know or remember that you belong to each other, even if you aren't going to church on Sundays, even if you aren't meeting in committee meetings in person or having social events? How are you staying connected? And then a final question, what difference do you imagine a renewed understanding and practice of covenant might make in your congregation over the next year and beyond? And particularly given the state of the world in this moment, it's important to think about, short term and longer. So on the 31st, we'll be offering a couple of things, and sort of this, we've offered a lot of presenting this time that has really focused on your congregation, but next time we want to look at what does it mean to be an association of congregations that is in covenant. What does it mean that our congregations are also in covenantal relationship to each other? And the other thing we're going to give you a chance to do is to apply what you're learning to some very specific case studies that we've come up with. So application will be one of the things you get to do together at our next session. So we hope that you stay healthy and safe between now and then, that your loved ones stay healthy and safe. We're going to close out with a reading of a beautiful poem that's been written specifically in response to this time by Lynn Unger, Pandemic. What if you thought of it as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel. Cease from buying and selling. Give up just for now on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing, pray, touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that has come clear. Do not reach out your hands, reach out your heart. Reach out your words. Reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. Amen. Thank you, friends. Have a blessed day.